We will now draw the state diagram for an edge detector using a Mealy finite state machine. We saw for a more finite state machine we needed to use 4 states because we had to remember the past 2 inputs. If we move to a Mealy design, we're about to see that we only have to remember the past input. Based on our past experience drawing the more finite state machine for the same problem, we are going to label our states by the past inputs, and we think we only need to remember the previous input only, not the last 2 inputs. And because it's a Mealy finite state machine, we do not associate outputs with the nodes. The outputs go on the arcs. So this node up here represents my previous input is a 0. If my current input is a 0, then I'm going to just go back here. So if my current input's a 0 and my previous input's a 0, I go back here because at the next rising edge I will have that my previous input was the current input a 0, hence this is the appropriate state. And if my previous input was a 0 and my current input's a 0, then no transition has occurred, so I output a 0. On the other hand, if the input was a 0 and is now a 1, and if it stays a 1 at the rising edge of the clock, then I transition to this state to signify that my previous input was a 1. So this is if the input is a 1, and if the previous input was a 0 and the current input is a 1, that's a transition, so my output is a 1 here. We finished the top node. It's got 2 different outputs, 1 for each possible input. If the input's 0, we go along this arc here, and if the input is a 1, we go through this transition here. Okay, that just leaves the bottom one. If the previous input was a 1 and the current input's a 1, then we just stay in this state because at the next rising edge we want to remember that our previous input was a 1. And if the previous input was a 1 and the current input's a 1, no transition is detected, so it's a 0 there. Otherwise, if the input is a 0, then I have detected a transition. The previous input was a 1, the current input's a 0, so we flag a transition there. And at the next rising edge of the clock, we move to this state up here to denote that my current input, which becomes the previous input at the next rising edge of the clock, this denotes my previous input is a 0. And here we have the state diagram for an edge detector using a Mealy design.